The pregnancy test trembled in Victoria Chen Morrison's hands like a captured butterfly, its twin pink lines stark against the white plastic window. Outside the bathroom of their Back Bay penthouse, Boston Harbor, stretched gray and infinite, under the February sky, ice crystals forming delicate patterns on the floor-to-ceiling windows. She pressed her palm against her still, flat stomach, imagining the miracle taking root inside her. After 18 months of trying, 18 months of carefully timed hope and monthly disappointments, this was finally happening. The sound of Alexander's voice drifted through the mahogany door, animated and urgent as he spoke into his headset. Something about the Aspen Winter Summit, the luxury hospitality conference that had consumed his thoughts for months. His tone carried the kind of enthusiasm she hadn't heard directed toward her in... How long now? Victoria took a breath that felt like swallowing starlight and stepped into their bedroom. "Alex!" Her voice caught on his name. "Alex, you need to see this." He stood silhouetted against the harbor view, his tall frame impeccably dressed even at 7 in the morning. Dark hair, perfectly styled expensive suit, fitting like it was tailored yesterday. Alexander Sterling Morrison never did anything halfway. His eyes flicked to the test in her hands, then immediately back to his laptop screen. "Okay," he said, his tone as flat as if she'd announced they were out of coffee. That's something. Something. The word hit her like ice water thrown against warm skin. Her world had just shifted completely off its axis, and he called it something. She stood there in silk pajamas, holding proof of the family they'd discussed for years, watching him scroll through what appeared to be venue specifications for a conference still 10 months away. "Aren't you excited?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast space of their home. "Sure, babe. Just processing." He replied without looking up. "You know I've got the Colorado site visit next week. Big client presentation." That night, Victoria lay awake planning their announcement. Maybe they could hire a photographer for one of those sweet reveal photos with tiny baby shoes. Perhaps a dinner party where they'd surprise both families simultaneously. She imagined the squeals of delight from her college roommate. Elena, the congratulatory, embraces the immediate planning for baby showers and nursery colors. Sleep came fitfully filled with dreams of tiny fingers and first steps of Alex reading bedtime stories and teaching their child to ski on the slopes of Vermont. Dreams that felt more vivid and real than his reaction had been. The first doctor's appointment arrived like Christmas morning in Victoria's mind. She'd taken the entire afternoon off from her marketing firm, bought a special leather-bound notebook to record everything Dr. Patricia Wong would tell them, and even packed Alex's favorite protein bars knowing he got irritable when his blood sugar dropped. She'd sent him 3 reminder texts throughout the week. She'd put it in his digital calendar with alerts. She'd mentioned it over dinner just the night before. He never showed up. Victoria sat in that sterile waiting room at Massachusetts General, surrounded by glowing couples, holding hands, checking her phone obsessively for his inevitable excuse. The text came at exactly their appointment time. "Emergency client call about Aspen venues. You'll be fine, just get the basic info." Basic info. About their first child. Their miracle after 18 months of trying. The nurse called her name, Victoria Morrison, and she walked into that examination room alone. Dr. Wong smiled warmly as she squirted cold gel on Victoria's stomach, but her eyes kept darting to the empty chair beside the examination table. "Where's Dad today?" she asked gently, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who'd seen this before. "Business emergency." Victoria lied the words, tasting bitter. You know how it is. But she didn't know how it was. She didn't understand how a venue consultation could matter more than hearing their baby's heartbeat for the first time. She didn't understand how he could miss this moment they'd dreamed about for years. The heartbeat filled the room, fast, strong, determined. Victoria stared at the grainy ultrasound image, trying to make out a nose or tiny fingers, and felt tears streaming down her cheeks. This was supposed to be their moment. Instead, she was sharing it with a kind stranger who handed her tissues and pretended not to notice the wedding ring on her finger that suddenly felt heavy and meaningless. "Everything looks perfect," Dr. Wong said, printing out several ultrasound photos. "Baby's measuring right on track for 8 weeks. Heartbeat is strong and healthy." That evening, Victoria showed Alex the ultrasound photos with shaking hands. He glanced at them for maybe 5 seconds before setting them on the kitchen counter next to junk mail and grocery store circulars. "Cool," he said, not looking up from his phone. "Looks like a little blob." A blob. Their baby. Their miracle. A blob. "The doctor said everything looks perfect." Victoria offered, desperate for some connection, some sign that this mattered to him. "That's good," he replied absently, thumbs scrolling through what she could see were work emails. "When's the next one?" "March 14th, actually. It's… I might have something that day. The Aspen conference prep is getting intense." Aspen. She'd heard about it in passing, some luxury hospitality summit that his company attended annually. It was still 10 months away, but apparently it was already more important than their baby's development. The second appointment came and went the same way, then the third. Each time Alex had a more elaborate excuse client presentation in Denver, emergency board meeting, traffic impossible due to construction. Victoria stopped asking him to come. The disappointment was becoming too heavy to carry. But the worst part was that she could see what genuine excitement looked like, because Alex showed it to everyone else. When his business partner, Carlos, announced his wife Camille's pregnancy just 2 weeks after Victoria's, Alex was the first to congratulate them. He bought them champagne, sent flowers, asked detailed questions about due dates and gender predictions. "That's incredible news," he'd exclaimed, embracing Carlos with genuine enthusiasm. "You guys are going to be amazing parents." Victoria watched from across the restaurant table, her own pregnancy barely showing at 12 weeks, as her husband celebrated someone else's baby with the joy he'd never shown for theirs. When Carlos mentioned their first ultrasound appointment, Alex immediately offered to adjust their business meeting schedule to accommodate it. "Family comes first," Alex had said, raising his glass in a toast. "Nothing's more important than these moments. Nothing." Apparently, except when it came to his own family, his own moments, his own wife sitting right there carrying his child, wondering what she'd done wrong to deserve such indifference. That night, Victoria finally understood that the problem wasn't her timing, her approach, or her expectations. The problem was that Alex simply didn't care. The excuses became an art form. Alex had perfected the language of corporate urgency, wielding phrases like client emergency and board directive, like shields against any inconvenient family obligations. By her 16th week, Victoria had learned to expect his absence rather than hope for his presence. "The Aspen expansion requires my full attention right now," he explained, when she mentioned their upcoming anatomy scan, the appointment where they'd finally learn if they were having a boy or girl. "You understand how important this deal is for our future, right? For the baby's future." He had a way of making his abandonment sound like sacrifice, his selfishness like strategy. The Aspen deal would set them up financially, he claimed. The conference would secure their long-term stability. Every missed appointment was an investment in their family's security, even though their family barely existed in his mind. Dr. Wong had stopped asking about Alex after the 4th solo visit. Instead, she'd begun offering subtle accommodations that spoke volumes about what she'd witnessed in her practice. "Would you like me to print extra copies of the ultrasound photos?" she'd asked gently. Sometimes partners appreciate having their own set when they can't make it. Extra copies that would sit untouched on kitchen counters, buried under business documents and conference itineraries. The anatomy scan fell on a Thursday afternoon in March. Victoria had blocked out the entire day knowing this appointment would be longer, more detailed. They'd finally see their baby's face clearly count, fingers and toes learn whether to buy pink or blue. She'd even bought a small gift bag with cards inside, planning to surprise Alex with the gender reveal when he came home. "Definitely can't make this one," he'd said over breakfast, not looking up from his phone. Luis is flying in from Denver specifically for our Aspen prep meeting. These partnerships don't wait for convenient timing. Luis Mendoza was Alex's business partner, a charming Coloradan who'd built a hospitality empire across the Mountain West. Victoria had met him several times at company events, always impeccably dressed, always charismatic, always treating her with the kind of warm attention that made Alex's coldness feel even more stark by comparison. "The anatomy scan is kind of a big deal," Victoria said carefully, knowing that pushing too hard would only make him more defensive. "It's when we find out the sex." "I know what it is," he replied, finally looking up with mild irritation. "We'll celebrate when I get home. Maybe we can go to dinner or something." Maybe. Even their celebrations were conditional, dependent on his schedule, his mood, his willingness to briefly acknowledge the life growing inside her. Victoria drove to the appointment alone, parking in the medical center garage that had become as familiar as her office building. The waiting room was full of couples, as always men holding their wives' hands, rubbing their backs, asking questions about the upcoming procedure with genuine concern and excitement. "Flying solo again today?" Sandra, the ultrasound technician, asked as Victoria settled onto the examination table. Sandra was in her 50s with knowing eyes and gentle hands, the kind of woman who'd probably seen every variation of family dynamics in her 20-year career. "Business meeting," Victoria replied automatically, the excuse so practiced it felt scripted. Sandra nodded with understanding that felt more like pity. She squeezed warm gel onto Victoria's rounded belly, now prominent enough that strangers had started offering her seats on the subway and asking about her due date with genuine excitement. "Let's see what baby's up to today," she said, moving the ultrasound wand across Victoria's skin. The familiar whooshing of the heartbeat filled the room strong and steady. The image on the screen was startlingly clear. Victoria could see the profile, the delicate curve of the nose, tiny fingers pressed against a cheek. This was their baby. Not a blob, not an inconvenience, but a real human being with expressions and personality already emerging. "Would you like to know the sex?" Sandra asked, pausing the wand over a particular area. "Yes," Victoria whispered, tears already building. "Please. Congratulations, Mama, you're having a little girl." "A girl, a daughter." Victoria pictured tea parties and bedtime stories teaching her to be strong and confident, showing her that she deserved to be celebrated and cherished. Everything Victoria was struggling to remember about her own worth. Sandra printed out a dozen photos more than usual. "These are beautiful images," she said, handing Victoria the warm prints. "Dad's going to love seeing these." Victoria nodded, knowing the photos would likely meet the same fate as all the others. A brief glance before being filed away with utility bills and takeout menus. The drive home gave her time to plan the reveal. She stopped at a boutique baby store and bought the tiniest pink dress she could find, soft as a whisper with delicate white embroidery around the collar. She arranged the ultrasound photos on their dining table, with the dress creating a small shrine to their daughter's first official portrait session. Alex arrived home at nearly 9 p.m., his tie loosened and hair slightly disheveled from what he claimed was a 12-hour strategy session with Luis. "How'd it go?" he asked, dropping his briefcase and immediately reaching for his phone to check messages. "We're having a girl," Victoria said, gesturing toward the dining table display. He glanced over, his expression neutral. "Cool, a girl." He picked up one of the ultrasound photos, studied it for perhaps 10 seconds, then set it down. "Did they say everything looks healthy?" "Perfect, she's perfect." "Good, that's good." He was already walking toward his home office phone pressed to his ear. "Luis, sorry, just got home. What were you saying about the Aspen venue specifications?" Victoria stood in their dining room, surrounded by evidence of their daughter's existence, listening to her husband prioritize conference logistics over meeting his child for the first time. The pink dress seemed to mock her with its innocence, a symbol of hope, in a house where hope felt increasingly naive. That night, she carefully packed away the ultrasound photos and the little dress in a memory box she'd started keeping in their bedroom closet, evidence of a pregnancy that apparently only mattered to her. documentation of moments that should have been shared but were experienced in solitude. The pattern was undeniable now. This wasn't about bad timing or work stress or temporary prioritization of career over family. This was about fundamental indifference, systematic dismissal of anything that required emotional investment in their future together. Victoria was organizing the memory box when she found them letters addressed in elegant handwriting to "My dearest granddaughter." But these weren't addressed to her. The name on the envelope read Sarah Chen, Portland, Oregon. Her hands trembled as she stared at the address. Sarah Chen, the same last name as her grandmother, Margaret Rose Chen, who had died when Victoria was 12, but Victoria was an only child. Her mother, Margaret's daughter, had been an only child too. Hadn't she? The letters were tucked behind her grandmother's jewelry box, the one Victoria had inherited when she turned 18. She'd never noticed the hidden compartment before revealed now, only because she'd been pressing too hard against the velvet lining while placing the ultrasound photos inside. There were dozens of letters spanning years. The most recent was dated just 6 months ago, long after Margaret's death. Victoria's hands shook as she opened the top envelope. "My dearest Sarah, I know you may never forgive me for the choices I made when you were young. I know that the trust fund payments I've been sending cannot replace the presents I denied you. But I need you to know that not a day passes without my thinking of you and little Emma. Your sister, Victoria, is pregnant now. She doesn't know about you. I've protected her from so many truths, perhaps too many. But I believe the time is coming when you girls will need each other. The lawyers have my instructions. When Victoria discovers these letters, they are to contact you immediately. What you choose to do with that information is entirely up to you. I loved you both, even when I failed to show it. Your grandmother, Margaret Rose Chen." Victoria sank onto her bedroom floor, letters scattered around her like fallen leaves. A sister. She had a sister named Sarah living in Portland who had been receiving money from their grandmother, a sister with a daughter named Emma, a sister their grandmother had apparently abandoned, just as Alex was abandoning Victoria now. Her phone buzzed with a text from Alex, "Working late again, Aspen planning session running long. Don't wait up." Victoria stared at the message, then at the letters surrounding her. The pattern wasn't just in her marriage, it was generational. Margaret Rose Chen, the grandmother she'd idolized, had abandoned her own family to build her business empire. And now Victoria was pregnant alone, discovering that her family had secrets as deep as the harbor outside her window. She picked up the most recent letter with trembling fingers. At the bottom, in Margaret's familiar handwriting, was a phone number with a Portland area code. Before she could second-guess herself, Victoria dialed. The phone rang twice before a woman's voice answered, wary and tired. "Hello. Is this Sarah Chen?" A long pause. "Who's asking?" "My name is Victoria Morrison. I think you might be my sister." The silence that followed felt like falling through ice, shocking, disorienting, and utterly transformative. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was sharp with years of carefully controlled pain. "So, you finally found them, the letters. I wondered when Margaret would let you in on the family's secret." "I don't understand," Victoria whispered. "I thought I was her only granddaughter." Sarah's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "You were the only one she claimed, the only one she bothered to raise. The rest of us were just inconvenient truths." Victoria pressed her hand against her belly, feeling their daughter move for the first time a flutter, like butterfly wings against her palm. "Sarah, I'm pregnant, and I'm alone. My husband, he's not—" "Let me guess," Sarah interrupted. "He's too busy with work to care about your pregnancy. Sound familiar?" The parallel hit Victoria like a physical blow. "How did you know?" "Because Margaret told me the same story about your grandfather, about my father, about every man in our family for 3 generations. Chen women, it seems, have a talent for loving men who disappear when things get real." Victoria found herself crying, not the gentle tears of pregnancy hormones, but deep grieving sobs for the sister she'd never known she had, for the pattern she was apparently destined to repeat, for the little girl growing inside her who might inherit this legacy of abandonment. "Sarah," she whispered through her tears, "I don't want to do this alone." Another long pause, then softer, "You're not alone, Victoria. You never were. You just didn't know how to find me." Outside their penthouse windows, Boston Harbor reflected the city lights like scattered diamonds. Inside Victoria, Chen Morrison held her phone with one hand and her pregnant belly with the other, finally understanding that her story was bigger than her marriage, deeper than her husband's indifference. She was part of something generational, something that had been broken for decades, and maybe, just maybe, something that could finally be healed. Sarah Chen arrived in Boston on a gray April morning, stepping off the Amtrak at South Station, with the careful posture of someone who had learned not to expect too much from family reunions. Victoria spotted her immediately, the same dark hair, the same determined jawline that stared back from mirrors. But Sarah's eyes carried a wariness that Victoria was only beginning to understand. They met at a coffee shop in the North End neutral territory, where neither of them had memories to navigate around. Sarah was 32 to Victoria's 29, but she moved with the efficient grace of someone who had been responsible for others for a very long time. A 4-year-old daughter Victoria had learned during their nightly phone calls over the past 3 weeks. Emma, a little girl who asked constant questions about the rich grandmother she'd never been allowed to meet. "You look exactly like her," Sarah said, without preamble, settling into the cafe chair across from Victoria. "Like Margaret when she was young. I used to have a photograph." "What happened to it?" "I burned it. When Emma was born and Margaret never came to meet her." Sarah's voice was matter-of-fact, but Victoria caught the tremor underneath. "Some bridges you torch them yourself, rather than wait for someone else to blow them up." Victoria placed her hands on her rounded belly, 7 months now, their daughter moving constantly, as if sensing the emotional turbulence around her. "Tell me what she was really like, Margaret. Not the grandmother who left me that jewelry box and trust fund. The one who abandoned you." Sarah stirred her coffee with deliberate slowness, and Victoria realized this was how her sister processed pain, by slowing everything down until she could manage it. "She was brilliant," Sarah said finally. "Absolutely brilliant at business. Could walk into any room and within an hour understand exactly how to make everyone in it need her. But she was also terrified. Terrified of what? Of being ordinary. Of being just another woman whose life got smaller instead of bigger." Sarah looked out the window at the harbor where ferries moved like determined insects across the gray water. "She had me when she was 23. Too young," she said, "before she'd built anything that mattered." Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the April weather. What did she do? "She left. Just disappeared one day when I was 6. Left me with my father, her first husband, and a promise that she'd come back when she'd made something of herself." Sarah's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "She did come back, 15 years later, rich, successful, and ready to play grandmother, but only on her terms." "What terms?" "Complete control. She wanted to send me to boarding school, then college, then law school, map out my entire life according to her vision of success. When I got pregnant with Emma, when I chose love over career advancement," Sarah shrugged, "I became inconvenient again." Victoria's daughter kicked sharply against her ribs as if protesting the story she was hearing in the womb. "But she kept sending you money. Guilt money. Monthly payments with notes about securing Emma's future and making better choices. Never any real acknowledgement of what she'd done. Never any real attempt to know us as people instead of projects." The coffee shop around them hummed with the comfortable noise of other people's ordinary lives. Students studying, business people having meetings, couples planning weekends. Victoria envied them their simplicity, their ability to sit in public spaces without dismantling decades of family mythology. "Sarah," she said carefully, "I think she did the same thing to me, just differently. How? Victoria told her about the trust fund she'd discovered only recently, about the legal documents that had appeared after Margaret's death, about the sense that her entire life had been orchestrated by someone who was no longer alive to explain her motivations. "She overprotected you instead of abandoning you," Sarah said when Victoria finished. "Same control, different method. And now I'm married to a man who's doing exactly what Margaret did to you, prioritizing everything else over family." Sarah leaned forward, and for the first time since arriving, her expression softened. "Tell me about him, your husband." Victoria found herself describing Alex not as she'd always seen him, successful, ambitious, driven, but as Sarah might see him. A man who scheduled his life around conferences and client calls, who treated pregnancy like a business disruption rather than a miracle, who disappeared emotionally long before he'd physically leave for his precious Aspen summit. "He's not cruel," Victoria said, surprising herself with the realization. "He's just absent. Like he's already decided that choosing family means losing himself." "Sounds familiar. Margaret, your grandfather, my father, Emma's father." Sarah's voice carried the weight of generational recognition. Chen women have been choosing emotionally unavailable men for 3 generations, maybe longer. Victoria felt her daughter settle into a quieter position, as if even in the womb she was listening to this catalog of family patterns. Do you think it's too late to break the cycle?" Sarah smiled for the first time since arriving, and Victoria saw glimpses of the little girl who had waited 15 years for her mother to come home. "That depends," Sarah said. "Are you willing to do what Margaret never did, which is choose family over fear, choose love over control, choose being present over being powerful?" The first family dinner happened by accident. Victoria had invited Sarah to stay at the penthouse during her Boston visit, and Alex came home early from a client dinner unusual enough that Victoria wondered if he was checking up on their house guest rather than genuinely wanting to meet his sister-in-law. Sarah was helping Victoria prepare a simple pasta dinner while 4-year-old Emma played with blocks on the living room floor, chattering constantly to herself, in the way that only preschoolers could sustain. The domestic scene felt foreign in their usually pristine penthouse toys, scattered across expensive rugs, children's laughter, echoing off marble countertops. Alex appeared in the doorway of their kitchen like a man entering unfamiliar territory. "You must be Sarah," he said, extending his hand with practiced charm. "Victoria's told me so much about you." Sarah accepted the handshake but didn't return the smile. "Funny, she's told me almost nothing about you." Victoria froze wooden spoon halfway to her mouth for tasting, but Alex seemed to take Sarah's directness as a challenge rather than an insult. "Well, we'll have to remedy that," he said. "Victoria mentioned you live in Portland. Beautiful city. I've been looking at some properties out there for potential development." "What kind of development?" "Luxury hospitality. High-end retreats for executives who want to disconnect from city stress." Alex warmed to his subject the way he always did when discussing business. "The Pacific Northwest has incredible potential for rich people to visit nature without actually experiencing it," Sarah finished. Alex paused, clearly recalibrating. "I wouldn't put it quite like that." "How would you put it?" Victoria watched this exchange with growing fascination. Sarah wasn't being hostile exactly, but she was stripping away the social lubrication that usually made Alex's conversations flow smoothly. She was asking direct questions and expecting direct answers. "I'd say we're providing opportunities for people to reconnect with what matters," Alex said carefully. "What matters? Family, relationships, the things that get lost in the day-to-day grind of career building." Sarah's smile was sharp as winter sunlight. "Interesting. When was the last time you reconnected with what matters?" Emma chose that moment to run into the kitchen, her small arms wrapping around Sarah's legs with unconscious trust. "Mama, can we eat now? I'm hungry, and the baby's probably hungry too." She pointed at Victoria's belly with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who had grown up around pregnancy discussions. "The baby's name is going to be Grace," Victoria said, lifting Emma onto her hip with some difficulty. "Grace Rose. Rose, like great-grandma Margaret," Sarah added, and Victoria caught the slight edge in her voice. Alex's expression shifted, confusion replacing his usual social smoothness. "I'm sorry, great-grandma who—" Victoria felt the evening pivot around that question like a door swinging open on a room that had been locked for years. "Margaret Rose Chen," Victoria said quietly. "My grandmother. Sarah's grandmother. The one I told you about who left me the trust fund." "You have a grandmother's trust fund?" Alex's voice carried a note Victoria had never heard before. Not exactly alarm, but a sharp attention that suggested this information mattered to him in ways she didn't understand. "Had," Sarah corrected. "She died when Victoria was 12. But apparently she'd been planning for Victoria's future for years." "What kind of planning?" Victoria found herself explaining the legal documents she'd discovered, the investment portfolio that had been growing for decades, the business holdings that she was only beginning to understand. With each detail, Alex's expression grew more focused, more calculating. "How much are we talking about?" he asked finally. "Alex," Victoria said, embarrassed by his bluntness. "It's a reasonable question," Sarah said, but her tone suggested she'd been expecting it. "Margaret was very successful, very strategic about her investments." "Strategic? How?" Sarah and Victoria exchanged glances. They'd spent hours on the phone discussing this, trying to piece together the scope of Margaret's business empire from bank statements and legal documents that read like archaeological artifacts. "She owned pieces of things," Victoria said slowly. "Real estate, hospitality companies, resort management firms." Alex went very still. "What kind of resort management firms?" "Mountain West Hospitality Group," Sarah said, watching his face. "Rocky Mountain Resort Development, Alpine Conference Services." The color drained from Alex's face so completely that Victoria worried he might faint. "Those are Luis's companies," he whispered. "Those are the companies organizing the Aspen Summit." Emma tugged on Victoria's shirt, oblivious to the adult tension. "Can we eat now, please?" But Victoria couldn't take her eyes off her husband's face as the implications settled over him like snow beginning to fall. "Victoria, he said slowly, "are you telling me that you own controlling interests in the companies that handle my conference?" "I don't know what I own," Victoria admitted. "The lawyers are still sorting through everything, but Sarah's been getting trust fund payments for years, and I think Margaret built something much bigger than any of us realized." Alex sank into one of their kitchen chairs as if his legs had stopped working. "The Aspen Summit represents 18 months of my career. Every important client I have will be there. Every partnership I've been building will be fine," Victoria said automatically. But even as she spoke, she wondered if that was true. Sarah set Emma down gently and moved to the stove, stirring the pasta, with movements that suggested she was thinking very carefully about what to say next. "Alex," she said without turning around, "can I ask you something?" "Sure." "What would happen if the Aspen conference was canceled?" "It won't be canceled. It's been planned for." "But what if it was?" Alex was quiet for a long moment. "My career would be over. Luis would probably sue me for breach of contract. Every client relationship I've built would be destroyed." "And if that happened," Sarah continued, still stirring pasta, "what would matter to you then?" Victoria held her breath, waiting for his answer. Emma had wandered back to her blocks, humming tunelessly to herself, creating a soundtrack of innocence underneath their adult complications. "I don't know," Alex said finally, and Victoria heard something in his voice that she hadn't heard in months. Vulnerability, uncertainty, fear, maybe, Sarah said finally, turning to face them both. "That's exactly what you need to figure out." The quiet moment came 3 weeks later at 2:00 in the morning. Victoria had been unable to sleep. Grace was particularly active at night, now practicing gymnastics routines against her ribs, so she'd gotten up to make tea and found herself in the nursery they'd finally started preparing. The room was half-finished, caught between Alex's periodic bursts of enthusiasm and his constant distractions. A crib stood assembled but not yet set up. Boxes of baby clothes remained unopened, and paint samples were taped to one wall in a rainbow of possibilities. She was sitting in the rocking chair they'd bought the week before Alex's first purely baby-related purchase when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Alex appeared in the doorway, hair disheveled, wearing the MIT t-shirt he'd had since college. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. Victoria shook her head, one hand resting on her belly, where Grace was performing what felt like somersaults. Alex entered the room cautiously, as if crossing into foreign territory. He'd been different since Sarah's visit, quieter, more thoughtful, less certain about things that had once seemed obvious to him. "She's really active tonight," Victoria said softly. "Can I—" Alex gestured toward her belly, and Victoria nodded. He knelt beside the rocking chair and placed his hands gently on her stomach. Almost immediately, Grace kicked against his palm, making him smile with surprise. "She's strong," he murmured. "She gets that from Sarah's side of the family, I think. The Chen women are survivors." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both of them focused on the small life moving between Alex's hands and Victoria's ribs. The city was quiet around them, Boston settling into the peaceful hours between night and dawn. "Victoria," Alex said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared." "Of what?" "Of being like my father, of disappearing into work, because it's easier than figuring out how to be present for the people who need me." Victoria felt tears building behind her eyes, not the hormonal tears that had plagued her throughout pregnancy, but deeper ones that came from hearing her husband finally name the thing she'd been feeling for months. "You don't have to be like your father," she said. "Don't I?" "He missed most of my childhood building sterling hotels. My mother raised me and Catherine essentially alone, while he traveled constantly, always chasing the next deal, the next expansion, the next level of success." Grace kicked again, softer this time, as if settling down to listen. "But you're here now," Victoria pointed out, "at 2 a.m. in our daughter's nursery having this conversation. Because I can't sleep. Because I keep thinking about what Sarah asked me, about what would matter if everything else fell apart." What would matter? Alex looked up at her, and in the dim light from the hallway, Victoria saw the man she'd fallen in love with 4 years ago, before the business pressures and conference planning and systematic emotional distance. "This," he said simply, "you, her, this family we're building." Then why does the Aspen conference feel more important than our ultrasound appointments? It was the question Victoria had been afraid to ask directly, the one that had been living in the space between them for months. Alex was quiet for so long that Victoria wondered if he was going to answer at all. Grace had settled into stillness, as if she too was waiting. "Because," Alex said finally, "succeeding at work feels like something I know how to do. And being a father, being a good husband during something as enormous as pregnancy, feels like something I could fail at completely." The honesty in his voice broke something open in Victoria's chest. "So you chose to fail at it preemptively," she said gently. "I chose to focus on the thing I could control, and abandoned the thing that mattered most." Alex nodded, his hand still resting on her belly. "I abandoned you. I abandoned her. I abandoned us." Victoria reached down and covered his hands with hers. "You haven't lost us yet, Alex, but you're close." They sat together in the unfinished nursery, the 3 of them, soon to be 4, finally occupying the same emotional space for the first time in months. Outside, Boston Harbor reflected the pre-dawn sky like dark glass, and somewhere across the country, conference planners were finalizing details for an event that had consumed Alex's life for a year. "What if we canceled it?" Alex said suddenly. "Canceled what?" "The Aspen Summit. What if we just didn't go?" Victoria felt her heart stutter. "You can't cancel it. Luis would survive. The industry would adapt. There would be consequences, professional and financial, but—" He looked up at her again. What if we chose the consequences we could live with instead of the ones we couldn't? Grace kicked once more gently, as if offering her opinion on this family decision. "Are you sure?" Victoria whispered. "I'm not sure of anything," Alex admitted, "except that I don't want to become the kind of man who misses his daughter's birth for a conference call." Victoria felt something shift deep in her chest, like tectonic plates finding a new way to fit together. "The conference is in 6 weeks." "I know." "Luis will be furious." "I know." "Your career might not recover." Alex smiled, and Victoria saw glimpses of the man who had proposed to her on a beach in Maine, who had once talked about wanting to teach their children to sail and ski and believe in themselves. "Then maybe it's time to build a different kind of career," he said, "one that doesn't require abandoning the people I love." And as the first light of dawn began to filter through the nursery windows, Victoria felt their daughter settle into calm stillness, as if finally sensing the peace she'd been hoping for all along. The second revelation came hidden in Margaret's papers like a time bomb set to detonate decades after her death. Victoria was going through the final boxes from her grandmother's estate when she found the folder marked Sterling Family Confidential. Inside were newspaper clippings, financial records, and what appeared to be private investigator reports dating back 25 years. Sarah was visiting again. These monthly trips had become routine as their relationship deepened, and she was the one who first understood what they were looking at. "Victoria," Sarah said slowly, spreading the documents across the dining table, "I think Margaret knew about Alex's family long before you married him." The evidence was methodical and damning. Reports on Sterling Hotel's business practices, including a pattern of acquiring family-owned properties through financial manipulation, photographs of Robert Sterling Alex's father at various business functions over the years, financial records showing suspicious connections between Sterling Holdings and companies that Margaret had systematically outbid or undermined. "This doesn't make sense," Victoria said, her hands shaking as she read through depositions from families who had lost generational businesses to Sterling Hotel's aggressive expansion tactics. "Why would Margaret collect all this?" Sarah held up a letter dated 3 months before Victoria's wedding, written in Margaret's distinctive handwriting. "Read this," she said. "The Sterling family represents everything I have spent my career fighting against the systematic destruction of family businesses for corporate profit. Robert Sterling ruined my friends the Nakamuras when he forced them to sell their resort in Vermont. He destroyed the Rodriguez family's inn in New Hampshire through predatory lending practices. I had hoped that his son might be different. I have had Alexander investigated thoroughly, and he appears to be genuinely ignorant of his father's methods. However, the family pattern concerns me deeply. If Victoria chooses to marry him, she must go into that union with full knowledge of what she faces, and more importantly, with full power to protect herself if the Sterling family attempts to treat her as they have treated so many others, as an obstacle to be removed or a resource to be consumed." Victoria sank into her chair, the implications washing over her like cold water. She knew. She knew what Alex's family was, and she let me marry him anyway. "She gave you the power to protect yourself," Sarah corrected. "Look at the next page." And the final document was a corporate filing showing that Margaret had quietly acquired controlling interests in most of Sterling Hotel's major suppliers and business partners over the course of 15 years. A systematic campaign that had positioned Victoria to essentially control her in-laws' business empire without anyone realizing it. "She turned you into the Sterling family's biggest threat," Sarah said, with grudging admiration. "They just don't know it yet." Victoria's phone rang, interrupting her attempt to process this information. Alex's name appeared on the screen. "Hey," she answered, trying to keep her voice normal. "Victoria, we need to talk. Can you come to my office? Is everything okay? Just please come. And bring Sarah if she's there. I think you both need to hear this." An hour later, Victoria and Sarah sat in the conference room at Sterling Hotel's downtown office, facing Alex across a mahogany table that probably cost more than most people's cars. Alex looked haggard, like he'd been having the same kind of morning revelations that had rocked Victoria's world. "My father wants to meet with you," Alex said without preamble. "About what?" "About the Aspen conference. About your grandmother's business holdings. About—" He ran his hands through his hair. "About the fact that you apparently own most of the companies that Sterling Hotels depends on for operations." Sarah leaned forward. "How did he find out?" "Luis told him. Apparently, Luis has been getting pressure from his board about honoring contracts with someone who has significant influence over their corporate structure." Victoria felt the baby kick sharply, as if Grace was responding to the tension in the room. "What kind of pressure?" "The kind that suggests your grandmother may have been planning this confrontation for years," Alex said. "Victoria, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Okay." "Did you know when you married me, did you know what your grandmother had been building?" Victoria met his eyes steadily. "I had no idea. I'm finding out about all of this at the same time you are." Alex's shoulders sagged with what looked like relief. "Okay, good. Because my father thinks this might all be an elaborate setup. That you married me to gain access to Sterling Hotels for some kind of corporate takeover." Sarah laughed, sharp and bitter. "Your father thinks a pregnant woman orchestrated a multi-decade business strategy while she was in elementary school. My father thinks that Margaret Rose Chen was capable of exactly that kind of long-term planning, and based on what Luis has discovered about her business holdings—" Alex spread his own papers across the table. He might be right. The documents Alex had brought painted a picture of Margaret's empire that was even more extensive than Victoria had realized. Resort properties across the Mountain West, transportation companies, even the catering firm that was supposed to handle the Aspen Conference's signature events. She positioned you to control every aspect of Sterling Hotel's business model, Alex said quietly. The question is why? Victoria thought about the folder marked Sterling Family, Confidential, that was sitting on her dining table at home. About the systematic pattern of business destruction that Alex's father had built his fortune on. About the families who had lost everything to Sterling Hotel's expansion. Maybe, she said carefully, she was tired of watching powerful men destroy things that other people had built. Alex stared at her for a long moment. Victoria, what aren't you telling me? Before she could answer, the conference room door opened and Robert Sterling walked in. Victoria had met Alex's father only a handful of times, always, at carefully orchestrated family events where conversation stayed safely focused on neutral topics. But seeing him now in his natural habitat of corporate intimidation, she understood for the first time why Margaret might have spent decades planning for this moment. Robert Sterling was a man accustomed to controlling every room he entered. Tall, silver-haired, and expensively dressed, he moved with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with money or influence. "Victoria," he said, settling into the chair at the head of the table without invitation. "We need to discuss your grandmother's legacy." "What about it? What about it?" Robert's smile was sharp as a knife blade. "Your grandmother has been systematically undermining my business for 15 years. She's positioned you to destroy everything I've built, and now you're married to my son. Some might call that a conflict of interest." Sarah spoke before Victoria could respond. "Some might call it justice." Robert's attention shifted to Sarah with the focus of a predator identifying new prey. "And you are Sarah Chen, Margaret's other granddaughter, the one she abandoned so she could focus on building the empire that's apparently giving you nightmares." Yes, the Portland branch of the family. I wondered when you'd surface." Victoria felt a chill at the casual way Robert dismissed Sarah's pain, as if the abandonment of a 6-year-old was simply a business decision to be noted and filed away. "Mr. Sterling," Victoria said, her voice steadier than she felt, "what exactly do you want?" I want to understand your intentions. You're about to give birth to my grandchild while holding enough corporate power to destroy my life's work. Some clarification of your plans would be appreciated. Alex leaned forward. Dad, she's not planning anything. This is all news to her, too. Is it? Robert's eyes never left Victoria's face. Because I've been doing some research on your grandmother, and Margaret Rose Chen was not the kind of woman who left things to chance. Every move she made was calculated. Every investment was strategic. And marrying her granddaughter to my son, well, that strikes me as the kind of long-term planning she was famous for. Victoria felt Grace kick again harder this time, as if responding to her racing heart rate. Are you suggesting that my grandmother somehow arranged my marriage? I'm suggesting that very few things in Margaret Rose Chen's life happened by accident. Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Are you listening to yourself? You think Margaret manipulated two people into falling in love so she could, what? Get revenge on your business practices 20 years later. I think Margaret Rose Chen was capable of exactly that level of strategic thinking. Yes. Well, you're wrong, Sarah said flatly. Margaret was many things, brilliant, ruthless, emotionally unavailable, but she wasn't a puppet master. If she positioned Victoria to have power over your family, it was to protect her, not to use her. Robert's expression shifted, slightly uncertainty creeping in around the edges of his confidence. Protect her from what? Sarah looked at Alex, then back at his father. From becoming another casualty of Sterling family business practices. The silence that followed felt like stepping off a cliff. Victoria could see Alex processing Sarah's words, understanding dawning in his expression, like sunrise breaking over difficult terrain. Dad, Alex said slowly, what did you do to Margaret's friends, the Nakamuras, the Rodriguez family? Robert's face went carefully blank. I have no idea what you're talking about. Because I'm starting to think, Alex continued, that maybe this isn't about corporate strategy at all. Maybe this is about consequences. Victoria felt the baby settle into stillness, as if Grace was holding her breath along with everyone else in the room. Outside the conference room, windows, Boston Harbor stretched gray and infinite, the same view that had watched 3 generations of Chen women navigate the treacherous waters of family loyalty and business survival. Robert, Victoria said quietly, I think it's time you told us the truth about why my grandmother really wanted to protect me from your family. Robert Sterling's composure cracked like ice under spring sun. He loosened his tie and looked out the conference room windows as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. The Nakamuras, he said finally, his voice stripped of its earlier authority. They owned Mountain View Resort in Vermont. Beautiful property. Been in their family for 3 generations. Alex leaned forward. What happened to them? They were over-leveraged. The 2008 financial crisis hit small resorts particularly hard. They needed capital to survive. And you provided it, Victoria asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Sterling Hotels offered to buy them out. Fair market value considering their debt situation. Sarah's laugh was cold as winter wind. Let me guess. Fair market value after you'd made sure their debt situation became untenable. Robert's silence was answer enough. How? Alex demanded. How did you make their debt situation worse? Business is business, Alexander. The Nakamuras had relationships with suppliers, lenders, tourism boards. Those relationships, sometimes circumstances change. Markets shift. Credit lines get called in early. Victoria felt sick as the implications settled over her. You systematically destroyed their support network so they'd have to sell to you. I created an opportunity for acquisition in a competitive market. You ruined them, Sarah said flatly. You destroyed a family's legacy so you could add another property to your portfolio. Alex stood up so abruptly his chair rolled backward into the wall. Jesus Christ, Dad. How many families did you do this to? Successful businesses require difficult decisions. How many Robert's facade finally crumbled completely? 17 properties over 12 years, all legal, all documented, all... He paused, seeming to hear his own words for the first time. All necessary for Sterling Hotels to become the company it is today. The conference room fell silent except for the distant sound of Boston Harbor traffic and the hum of the building's air conditioning system. Victoria placed both hands on her belly, feeling Grace move restlessly as if sensing the emotional earthquake happening around her. "The Rodriguez family," she said quietly. "Margaret mentioned them specifically. What happened to them?" Robert's shoulders sagged. "They owned Casa Rodriguez. Beautiful inn in New Hampshire, been operating for 40 years. And they needed renovations to meet new ADA compliance standards. The loans they needed. The banks they usually worked with suddenly found their credit profile insufficient. Banks that Sterling Hotels had relationships with," Alex said, understanding flooding his voice. "The hospitality industry is small. Everyone knows everyone. Sometimes a word from an established player can influence lending decisions." Victoria thought about Margaret's papers about the systematic documentation of each family's destruction, about the careful way her grandmother had positioned her to have power over the Sterling Empire. "She knew," Victoria said. "Margaret knew exactly what your family was capable of because she'd watched you do it to her friends." "Your grandmother was a formidable businesswoman," Robert said carefully. "I respected her intelligence even when we found ourselves on opposite sides of transactions." "But opposite sides," Sarah repeated. "You mean when you were destroying people and she was trying to save them?" "I mean when we had different approaches to business development." Alex moved to the window, staring out at the harbor with his back to his father. "All those years growing up listening to you talk about building something meaningful, creating jobs, contributing to communities. And you were actually just, what, a predator in an expensive suit." "Alexander, you're being dramatic. Business requires..." "Stop." Alex turned around, and Victoria saw something in his expression that reminded her powerfully of Sarah. A clarity that came from finally seeing through years of carefully constructed lies. "Just stop. Don't tell me about business requirements. Don't explain market forces. Just tell me the truth." Robert was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight Victoria hadn't heard before. "The truth is that I was 28 when I took over Sterling Hotels from your grandfather. The company was failing. We were going to lose everything: the business, the family, money, the reputation your great-grandfather had built. I had 6 months to turn things around or watch 4 generations of Sterling legacy disappear." He paused, seeming to gather himself. "The Nakamuras were our first acquisition. They were struggling, we needed properties, and I convinced myself that we were helping them by offering an exit strategy. But after we closed that deal, after I saw how much money we made, how quickly we could grow by acquiring distressed properties, it became easier each time." "Easier to destroy families?" Victoria said. "Easier to tell myself that business was separate from personal morality, that success justified the methods, that I was building something important enough to warrant the collateral damage." Alex returned to his seat, but Victoria could see the distance in his eyes, as if he was looking at his father for the first time. "Did Mom know? Your mother knew that Sterling Hotels acquired properties from financially distressed owners. She didn't know the details of how those situations arose." "You mean she didn't know you were the one creating the distress?" Robert nodded miserably. "I told myself I was protecting the family, protecting you and Catherine from the kind of financial insecurity I'd grown up with. But I was really just protecting myself from having to find another way to succeed." Victoria felt Grace kick sharply, as if responding to the tension in the room. She thought about the ultrasound appointments Alex had missed, the conference calls he'd prioritized over their relationship, the systematic way he'd chosen career advancement over family connection. "Alex," she said softly, "do you see it, the pattern?" Alex looked at her. Then at his father, understanding dawning in his expression like light, breaking through storm clouds. "I've been doing the same thing," he whispered. "Different methods, same choice. Protecting my career at the expense of everything else. The Aspen Conference," Victoria continued. "All those months of preparation, all those missed appointments, all those times you chose business over family. You were following the same playbook." "But I wasn't destroying anyone else's family," Alex protested. "I was just prioritizing wrong." Sarah spoke for the first time in several minutes, her voice gentle but implacable. "You were destroying your own family, just slower, more subtly." The truth of that statement settled over the room like dust after an earthquake. Victoria could see Alex processing the parallel understanding how the pattern of emotional abandonment that had defined Sterling men for generations had been playing out in their marriage without either of them fully recognizing it. "What do we do now?" Alex asked, and Victoria heard a vulnerability in his voice that reminded her of why she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. Before anyone could answer, Victoria's phone buzzed with a call from an unknown Colorado number. She answered without thinking. "Victoria Morrison, speaking. This is Luis Mendoza, Alex's business partner. I'm calling from Aspen. We have a problem." Victoria looked around the conference room at her husband, his father, and her sister, all of whom were watching her with varying degrees of apprehension. "What kind of problem, Luis?" "The kind where your grandmother apparently owns everything. The resort, the catering company, the transportation services, even the fucking airport. Everything we need for the conference answers to companies that answer to you." Victoria felt a strange calm settle over her, as if Margaret's long-term planning was finally revealing its true purpose. "I see. Do you? Because I have 300 executives arriving in Aspen next week for a conference that you can apparently cancel with a phone call, so I need to know right now what your intentions are." Victoria looked at Alex, who was staring at her with an expression that managed to combine hope, fear, and complete bewilderment. "My intentions," she said slowly, "are to do what my grandmother should have done 30 years ago, which is give you a choice." Victoria ended the call and set her phone on the conference table. The room was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. Or maybe that was Grace's heartbeat, the two of them sharing the same rhythm as they faced the most important decision of both their lives. "What choice?" Robert asked. Victoria stood up, one hand supporting her belly, and moved to the window where Alex had been standing. Boston Harbor spread out below them, the same view that had watched Margaret Rose Chen build her empire and plan her granddaughter's protection. "The choice to do things differently," she said without turning around. "The choice to break the pattern. The choice to build something based on cooperation instead of conquest." She turned back to face the room, and when she spoke, it was with Margaret's voice channeled through her own convictions. "Here's what's going to happen. The Aspen Conference will go forward as planned. Every contract will be honored, every service will be provided, every guest will have the experience they were promised." Luis's voice came through the phone speaker, which was apparently still connected. "Thank God. Victoria, you have no idea how much this means." "I'm not finished," Victoria continued. "In exchange, Sterling Hotels will establish a family business recovery fund. $20 million administered by an independent board dedicated to helping family-owned hospitality businesses that have been damaged by aggressive acquisition practices." Robert's face went white. $20 million, Victoria. That's a significant portion of our liquid assets. It's a fraction of what you made from the 17 families you destroyed. And it's non-negotiable. You can't be serious. Victoria smiled, and for the first time in months, she felt the full power of her position. "Robert, I control the companies that provide your hotels with linens, food service, transportation, and booking systems. I can make Sterling Hotels disappear without technically breaking a single law. $20 million to help rebuild what you destroyed is not just reasonable, it's merciful." Alex was staring at her with something that looked like awe. "Victoria, this is incredible. But are you sure that's a lot of money and a lot of power to wield?" "I'm sure, but there's one more condition." "What?" Victoria turned to face her husband directly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of everything they'd been through and everything they might still become. "You resign from Sterling Hotels. Today. You walk away from the family business and we build something new together. Something that doesn't require destroying other people's dreams to succeed." The silence that followed felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. Victoria could see Alex processing the enormity of what she was asking, walking away from the career he'd spent years building, the family legacy he'd been raised, to inherit the identity he'd constructed around being a Sterling. "If I do that," he said carefully, "what would we build instead?" "I don't know," Victoria admitted. "Something that allows you to be present for your daughter's birth. Something that doesn't require conference calls during ultrasound appointments. Something that values family as much as it values profit." Alex looked at his father, who was still processing the financial implications of Victoria's ultimatum, then back at Victoria. "What if I'm not good at anything else? What if everything I know about business comes from this?" He gestured at his father. "What if I fail?" Sarah spoke up from her corner of the room, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had rebuilt her life from scratch more than once. "Then you fail at something that matters instead of succeeding at something that doesn't." Victoria felt Grace move again, a gentle rolling motion that felt like approval, like encouragement, like the next generation offering its opinion on the choices being made in this corporate conference room overlooking Boston Harbor. "Alex," she said softly, "I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be present. I'm asking you to choose us over everything else the way Margaret chose her empire, over everything else the way your father chose business, success over family integrity. I'm asking you to be the first Sterling man in 3 generations to choose love over fear." Alex stood up slowly, and Victoria could see him mentally stepping away from everything he'd thought his life would be and towards something unknown, but potentially transformative. "Okay," he said simply. "Okay. Okay, I choose you. I choose Grace. I choose building something new together, even if I have no idea what that looks like." He turned to his father, and Victoria saw years of conditioning and expectation fall away like old paint. "Dad, I resign from Sterling Hotels effective immediately. You can handle the family business recovery fund however you want, but you'll handle it. Because I'm going to be busy learning how to be a father." Robert stared at his son as if Alex had announced he was joining a circus. "Alexander, you're being emotional. This is a major life decision that deserves careful consideration." "I've been carefully considering it for 7 months, Alex replied. "Every time I missed an appointment, every time I chose work over Victoria, every time I told myself that building my career was more important than building my family. This isn't emotional. This is the first rational decision I've made in years." Victoria felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in months, they were tears of relief rather than loneliness. Luisa's voice came through the phone, again smaller now, uncertain. "So the conference is still happening." "The conference is happening," Victoria confirmed, "and afterward you'll be working with Sterling Hotels to identify family businesses that need support instead of acquisition. Consider it a new market opportunity." She ended the call and looked around the conference room at her husband, who was texting his resignation to his assistant, her sister, who was watching this family transformation with quiet satisfaction, and her father-in-law, who looked like a man discovering that actions had consequences even 20 years later. "There's one more thing," Victoria said, addressing Robert directly. "Margaret left detailed records of every family Sterling Hotels damaged. Names, dates, financial impact, personal stories. Those records are now part of the legal foundation for the recovery fund. The families you hurt will have the opportunity to apply for assistance, and some of them will have the chance to buy back properties that were taken from them." Robert's face went through several emotions: shock, anger, resignation, and finally something that might have been relief. She really did plan all of this, he said wonderingly, for years, every detail. She planned for the possibility that her granddaughter might need protection from your family's business practices, Sarah corrected. She hoped she was wrong, but she prepared for being right. And now, Victoria placed both hands on her belly, feeling Grace settle into calm stillness, as if finally sensing the peace she'd been waiting for. Now we find out if 3 generations of sterling men can learn to build something without destroying something else first. 3 weeks later, Victoria went into labor on a Tuesday morning in May. This time, when the contractions started, Alex was beside her, timing them carefully and calling Dr. Wong's office with updates. When they arrived at Massachusetts General, he held her hand through every contraction and asked questions that showed he'd actually read the pregnancy books he'd been carrying around for months. Sarah arrived from Portland just as Victoria was transitioning to active labor, bringing Emma with her because 4-year-olds don't understand why they can't witness the miracle of new life entering the world. "Is the baby coming now?" Emma asked, pressing her small face against the window of the labor and delivery room. "Very soon." Victoria gasped between contractions. "Will she like blocks? I brought my favorite ones to share." Alex laughed, the sound bright with joy and anticipation. "I think she'll love blocks, Emma. I think she'll love having a cousin who shares her toys." Grace Rose Morrison Chen was born at 3:47 p.m. on May 15th, emerging into the world with a cry that filled the room with indignation and life. Alex cut the umbilical cord with tears streaming down his face. And when Dr. Wong placed their daughter on Victoria's chest, the first words Grace heard were her father saying, "Welcome to the world, sweetheart. We've been waiting so long to meet you." The room filled with the controlled chaos of post-birth procedures, but Victoria barely noticed. She was lost in studying Grace's perfect fingers, her shock of dark hair, her expression of serious concentration as she looked around at this bright, noisy world she'd been delivered into. "She looks like you," Alex said, his voice full of wonder. "She looks like herself," Victoria replied, and it was true. Grace had her own face, her own presence, her own way of existing that was completely separate from anyone else's expectations or plans. Emma approached the hospital bed with careful steps, clutching her wooden blocks. "Can I see her? Can I teach her about colors?" "In a few minutes," Sarah said gently. "Let Mommy and Daddy have their first moment." But Victoria gestured Emma closer. "It's okay. Grace needs to meet her family." And as Emma climbed carefully onto the hospital bed and began explaining to Grace about red blocks and blue blocks and the importance of building towers that don't fall down, Victoria felt something shift deep in her chest. This was what family looked like when it was built on presence, instead of power, on love, instead of control, on the radical choice to show up for each other's most important moments. Alex's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, then showed the screen to Victoria. It was from Luis. Aspen Conference was a huge success. Already have 3 family businesses interested in partnership opportunities instead of buyouts. Maybe Margaret was onto something after all. Victoria smiled, settling Grace more securely in her arms as Emma continued her detailed explanation of block-building principles. "I think," she said to Alex, "Margaret would be proud of the choice you made." "The choice we made," Alex corrected, leaning down to kiss Grace's forehead. "The choice to do things differently." Outside the hospital window, Boston Harbor stretched blue and infinite under the late afternoon sun, and somewhere in the city, 3 generations of Chen women had finally learned that the greatest inheritance you can leave your children isn't money or power or carefully orchestrated protection. It's the courage to choose love over fear, presence over success and family, over everything else that the world might try to convince you matters more. Grace Rose Morrison Chen slept peacefully in her mother's arms, surrounded by the sound of her cousin's laughter and her father's gentle voice and her aunt's quiet prayers for this new life to grow up, knowing she was wanted, celebrated, and unconditionally loved from the very first moment she drew breath. The legacy of abandonment that had defined the Chen family for 3 generations ended in that hospital room replaced by something Margaret Rose Chen had dreamed of, but never been brave enough to build herself a family that chose to stay. The hospital room had grown quiet, except for Grace's soft breathing and the distant murmur of Boston Harbor beyond the windows. Victoria watched her daughter's fingers curl around Alex's thumb with the unconscious trust of someone who had never known abandonment, and felt the weight of all the women who had come before them. Margaret, with her fierce love and fiercer control; Sarah, with her patient rebuilding of what others had broken herself with her choice to stop the pattern before it could claim another generation. Emma had fallen asleep in the visitor's chair, her wooden blocks scattered across the floor like the pieces of old stories, finally finding new ways to fit together. Sarah sat beside her daughter, one hand resting on Emma's shoulder, watching this family she had helped create from the fragments of what had been lost. "Do you think she knew?" Alex whispered, his eyes never leaving Grace's face. "Margaret, I mean. Do you think she knew it would end like this?" Victoria considered the question, thinking of all the careful plans and documents, all the protection built around possibilities that Margaret had hoped would never come to pass. All that power wielded not for conquest, but for the radical act of giving her granddaughter choices. "I think," Victoria said softly, adjusting Grace's tiny hospital cap. She knew that love was the only legacy worth leaving. Everything else was just insurance. Outside the harbor reflected the settling dusk like scattered prayers, and somewhere in the space between what had been broken and what was finally being built, Victoria wondered if healing was always this quiet, not the dramatic restoration she had imagined, but simply the gentle courage to choose differently when the same old patterns came calling. Grace stirred against her chest, and Victoria found herself asking the darkness beyond the windows, how many generations does it take to learn that staying is the bravest thing we can do?